I'm going to present some recent results from our Information as Fuel grant, our group. The PI on this group is John Bechthofer. He's an experimentalist at Simon Fraser University. And then David Zivak and I are co-PIs, both in theory. And this is information as fuel, right? And this is FQx, so you better say something controversial when you're starting. So, information as fuel, really? Come on, information is not a substance, right? So I'm not telling you any news here, but we all know that information really is embodied through some kind of correlations between two physical systems. Information is always information about something. And so in the case of information engines, these two physical systems are on the one hand the system that the demon is observing, so I call this the work medium, and that he can interact with and apply feedback to and get the work out. So this system helps the demon to utilize thermal fluctuations and turn them into useful energy, otherwise known as work. And the other system, of course, is the demon itself. So somewhere in the demon, there has to be a correlation between what is going on in the system, and this is where the information lies, right? So the demon has to have information about the system, and it has to have it kept somewhere in memory or written out on a piece of paper, but then the piece of paper becomes part of the demon in the accounting if you run this as like an engine in a cyclic way. So these two systems are then coupled by, on the one hand, the apparatus with which the demon can extract the work from the work medium, and on the other hand, the observation, so the measurement, and the way in which the demon represents its data. So how does it change its own memory? And I think the talk after me will focus a lot more on the details of the measurement, and I will focus here mostly on the detail, in the second part of my talk, mostly on the details of this memory making, which is in the spirit of Zilart. So in pictograms, here's what I just said. There is a system. You can observe something from it. You can use this observation to turn a knob on another physical system, which I call the observer, and to make sure that we know what we're talking about, I call it the physical observer, not some abstract observer. And then that guy can do some actions that depend on its own state and turn a knob on the work medium and thereby get work out. And to do this in any effective way, the guy has to make some kind of useful inference about what's going on with the work medium. So in art, here is what it is. My very charming son pointed out that my demon drawing was really not very good, and it was absolutely true. And so he took upon himself to make a better demon drawing with one of his signature birds, but equipped with a demon tail and a pitchfork. Interacting with a Zilart engine where you don't know where the particle is, which side it's on, right? What you need to know is which of the sides is empty, so that you can use the volume expansion to get work out of this engine and but thereby lift the weight. So you have to turn a switch here, that's the pitchfork, where you have to turn the switch, and you can only do that if you observe the system. And he changed the particle into a little bird head, which is also very charming. So this observer, like I said, it has to do something useful, and the minimum requirement for this observer is that it has a memory that is at least stable over the time scale over which it turns that knob. Yeah? And so somehow this observer has the task to map its memory, to map the observation that it has onto this memory. And this will require work. And therefore, if you run this whole engine, if this is your view of what the information engine is, and you run this whole thing in a cycle, and you run it at one temperature, then you can never get any net work out of this thing. Yeah? It's obvious. And if you allow this engine to have access to two temperatures, or more than two, but at least two temperatures, then of course you can get net positive work output. So for example, you could cool down your sensor, if you wish, which is also what every reasonable experiment does, right? And extract work at a higher temperature. You can also achieve this temperature difference, and you'll see this in a second, by adding non-equilibrium forcing, so that you don't actually change the ambient temperature much, but you use the non-equilibrium fluctuations to have a higher effective temperature. So if you allow at least access to 2 temperatures, then of course you're still limited by the Carnot efficiency, right? So we're not creating magic here, yeah, it's still physics, and information is only fuel if you cut part of that feedback loop. So if you view it like this, and you assume that the observer is given exactly the useful information that it needs to have to extract the work, then you can view information as fuel. Then information is a resource, and it can be turned directly into work. Like I said, it's nothing new, and you probably all know it. I just wanted to give a little bit of a broader overview for those of you who are in cosmology. You know, when you hear these things about breaking the second law of thermodynamics and so on, you should probably be suspicious. I don't know. It's the second law, not the second suggestion, right? I don't know. Maybe I'm too conservative. Nonetheless, I want to tell you, so we did a lot of projects and a lot of work over all these years, right? And instead of giving you a rushed sort of like summary of everything we did, I thought it would be better if I focused on 2 things. And one thing I want to focus on is the latest PRL that came out of this collaboration, and it just came out last week. And that's an experimental result, and you know, that's all the experiments were done at SFU. And this is the graduate student Tushar who did these experiments. And this is the FQx IAF sponsored postdoc that we shared on this grant, who did the theory for most of the theory for this paper. And this is David, the other co-PI, and another collaborator, experimentalist. So I will first talk about this latest PRL, which deals with this work medium part of the engine. And then I will switch to talking about the stuff that I have been, you know, driving a little bit more, which is this observer part of the engine. Okay, and this is has been largely, so the experiments are just on the way. We're a little bit running behind. This COVID kind of really did a number on us because of the distance and this ocean and 2 different countries and restrictions and whatnot. So we did some theoretical work that I want to explain to you a little bit, and Pitvaraj is just getting started doing these experiments. He's figured out how to do them, so I'm very hopeful. So part 1 is a real-world ratchet that can exploit non-equilibrium fluctuations, you know, to have this difference in sort of effective temperatures. This is based on really wonderful experiments developed in John's lab, where the idea here is that they had is to lift a weight, yeah? So to have like a literal way of lifting the weight. You know, in the Zilart box, for all of you who know it, you always have, you have to attach this, then you have to like equalize the pressure, get the volume expansion, some way you attach a weight. It's a thought experiment, right? So if you want to make it real, how do you make it very real and very literal? Well, you can just like literally try to lift a weight. So you attach some weight to a spring, and you have it in a heat bath, right? You're trying to exploit the fluctuations. Whenever it happens to fluctuate up, if you know that, you can just change the baseline in such a way that the potential energy doesn't change. And then you can basically float up this weight without apparently doing any work on it. So how they implement it is with a laser trap, right? So they adjust the center of the laser trap with optical tweezers. And of course, in reality, you know, here's the trapping laser, and you're floating this glass bead up. But in reality, you're burning a lot of energy because you're using this complicated measurement, acquisition, information processing, and control system on some FPGA, right? So it's really just addressing the one part of this engine, the optimization of the one part for the real world. So we'll get to the other one later. So they optimize this for power, and this happens if you use a heavy bead and a stiff trap. And of course, theoretically, this is a first passage problem. And now, what happens if you put this into a non-equilibrium environment? You can do this by applying amplified Johnson noise from a resistor. And so you can get additional fluctuations here, which are non-equilibrium fluctuations. So these are the thermal fluctuations. It's not very good if I point with my fingers, right? Especially for the video. How can I point more elegantly? Not much better. Here is the thermal baseline, and then there are non-equilibrium fluctuations on top of that with different amplitudes, different noise strength. Okay. So the well, yeah, that would be smart. I wouldn't have to run around. Can you see the mouse?
Yeah.
It's like tiny. I can't see it. So depending on the amplitude here of the non-equilibrium forcing, you can increase the power output, and then you can model that theoretically, and you can show that this will continue to grow, and that's kind of important because then you can ask yourself, well, what would be the minimum amount of information processing power that you would have to put in there, right? Not if you put it on an FPGA, but if in the future we can also build the daemon side and we can build it on some super efficient hardware, what would be the absolute minimum? And so we calculated that, and then you see that at some point there's a crossover point here, right? So that tells you that at least in principle, these engines can be useful in the real world. The other thing I wanted to point out that I forgot is in their first paper, they pointed out that already here at this power where you're just in an equilibrium bath, you can achieve basically a biologically meaningful range. Yeah. So here where you have powers that are comparable to biological motors. So this is quite exciting. I think this really tells us that these information engines aren't just great thought experiments, but they can really be ported into the real world. And then, of course, this relates to energy harvesting, right? Because what you're doing when you're on a sailboat isn't that much different, right, from an information engine. You adjust your sails in a clever way to catch the non-equilibrium fluctuations. Or a wind power generator has to adjust the leaves to the normal direction of the wind, right? So you could see how studying this and finding optimal ways to optimize this can help in many different areas, even maybe with some energy harvesting. So I hope you find it interesting. Now comes part 2, for which I have how much time? Do I have 20 minutes or 40?
Mm-hmm. The total talk should be 40.
Oh, okay.
Including.
I'm doing good. Now we want to ask, what about the real-world daemon part of the engine, right? Remember, the engine is made of 2 parts. So this daemon has to make some kind of decision. So this using an information engine as a minimal model can give us a chance to study decision-making under uncertainty from a purely physics point of view. And for me, I think this is very helpful because when I study decision-making under uncertainty from any other point of view, I always feel that quickly my intuition fails when the system becomes too complex. Yeah? And so I can use this really physical approach where there are no arbitrary assumptions or ingredients to build my own intuition, which then can equip me to study more complex systems and also from different points of view and extend this later on. This is my own personal motivation for doing this. I don't know if that resonates with you. So I want to go back to Maxwell here, because, after all, it's Maxwell's daemon. So we should always pay attention to the guy who came up with it. So very eloquently, he says, one of the best established facts in thermodynamics is that it is impossible in a system enclosed in an envelope which permits neither change of volume nor passage of heat, and in which both the temperature and the pressure are everywhere the same, to produce any inequality of temperature or of pressure without the expenditure of work. This is the second law of thermodynamics, and it is undoubtedly true as long as we can deal with bodies only in mass and have no power of perceiving or handling the separate molecules. Very good, right? So then you've all seen sketches of Maxwell's daemon. We saw that nice little game that your student programmed, right? So what's happening here? Well, in his letter to Tate, he wrote, "No work has been done, only the intelligence of a very observant and neat-fingered being has been employed." Emphasis on both observant and neat-fingered. Because often in information thermodynamics, people tend to think that the only limit is how much you know about the microstate of the system. But there's another limit, and that is what kind of apparatus do you have to make use of your knowledge. Right? It's quite obvious. So it was obvious to Maxwell. So if we analyze this, then we see that there is, what he talks about is the ability to perceive, to handle, and intelligence. Right? So the ability to perceive, what are your sensors? The ability to handle, what can you do? What are your actuators? Those are usually, at least for like real systems in the real world, like living systems or what have you, agents that aren't abstract, are usually given by the physics. Like, we can alter our perception a lot, right? Because we build all these fancy sensors and stuff, but for simpler organisms, they don't have much choice, right? However, the choice you have is when you think about the world, right? So the intelligence is entirely up to the demon. So you can, you have to get somehow from your perceptions to your actions, and the way in which you do that, that's up to you. And so now we want to know whether we can derive from some physical optimization principle an optimal method to create this kind of like, baseline intelligence. I'm not even sure I want to call it intelligence, but I guess Maxwell did, so I guess I can. Okay. So the goal here is to have a physical basis for, machine intelligence or natural intelligence or what have you. And the answer is yes, you can. You can derive something. And so I want to show you real quick, what is this and how does this come up? And to do that, I want to go back to Zilart's engine, which I hope most of you know. Please raise your hand if you've never heard of Zilart's engine. Oh, that's very good. Okay, so I want to point out that information engines are usually very carefully designed such that all of the information that you need to know to get the work out is actually observable or is inherent in the observation that you can make. So you don't have to guess, right? Because when we build something in the lab, why should we make it hard for ourselves? But in nature, that's different. That's completely contrary, actually, to what living systems encounter. So a real-world system would typically be limited in its data acquisition bandwidth and its sensors and its actuators, and so it would not know the full microstate of the system or even those quantities that it needs to know to get any kind of useful energy out of any environment that it can manipulate. It would have to make the best out of its observations and make an inference about the things that it needs to know. So in Zilart's box, what I'm talking about is this. You have this box with one particle in it, and somebody put a divider into it, so the particle can't tunnel, right? It can't get through the divider, so in that sense, the distribution is stabilized. And now you can observe where is the particle. Well, what you need to know is which side is empty, but observing the particle contains all the information you need to know, and how to map that to memory is now completely trivial. Because all you have to do is take the sign. If you put 0 here on the x-axis, you just have to take the sign. And then note that your memory now overlaps with a coarse graining of your observable, and it is the same as the underlying relevant quantity you need to know. So you have this complete degeneracy there in this kind of conceptual space, which is why for almost 100 years nobody noticed that you can extend this. So you can extend this to actually quite easily. You'll see that you should be extending this once you take real measurements, because then you have measurement noise. Oh, what I plotted here, this is important, is the probability that the left side of the box is empty, right? If the particle is found on the left, then the probability that the left side of the box is empty is 0. If the particle is found on the right, then the probability that the left side of the box is empty is 1. So it's completely deterministic. Okay? Now this changes, of course, as soon as you include measurement error. So now you can integrate over x and get as an answer for the probability that if you're sitting at a certain place, that the left side is empty, you get these curves, right? It depends on the variance. So if the intuition for this is if you're close to the middle, then there's some probability with which it's actually on the other side, right? Just because of your error. And this probability gets larger and larger and larger as the more you broaden your Gaussian. So you find as this probability over the quantity that you really care about, you find this sigmoid with different slopes. Now you can argue, well, you know, that's just measurement noise, I don't need to take care of that, I can always make that go to 0, and then I'm back to the Zilart picture. Yes, you can, but you could also say, well, I'm interested in the other case, when the noise is actually very large, because for some systems that might actually be the case. And then I have almost like a linear relationship, right? So now it becomes not clear, not trivial, let's say, not trivial. What is the best memory? So you already have an interesting problem there. Then this leads you to this linear problem, or a problem with linear uncertainty, and you can also get it in a different way. You can get it simply by observing the Zilart engine at an angle. And that corresponds exactly to a probability like this, right? Because now you have a region in the middle where with linearly increasing certainty, you know where the particle is. And you can map that with some geometric argument onto a Zilart box that just has a tilted divider. And in a similar fashion, you can actually map any binary decision problem onto a Zilart box with a funny shaped divider, which is kind of cool. That allows you to study this systematically. So we studied this, and the answer, and then you can really study like what are the optimal memories, how can you implement the Carnot equivalent of this this cycle, so the most efficient cycle, and what do the memories look like, and how can you actually build them. And we studied this, and the answer is that the physical code book is totally non-trivial, and you can talk like a long time about it, so it's like too much for such a short talk. So I want to show you something even simpler, which we will put on the archive very soon now, hopefully. And this is, imagine you have, what I wanted to point out is that here in this problem, even though it relates to the problem with the really spread out Gaussian noise error, right? It is still a different kind of uncertainty. It's an intrinsic uncertainty because now, even if you completely push your noise error to 0, this uncertainty doesn't go away, right? So it's like more like an underlying structural uncertainty. So here's the simpler problem. How am I doing for time? Imagine you have two kinds of experiences that you can have. One kind of experience which gives you complete knowledge about the thing that you want to learn about, and the other kind of experience which gives you absolutely no knowledge whatsoever. So you either know that the left side is empty, or it's symmetric, right? Then you know that the right side is not empty. Or you know nothing, so you have 1/2 probability for either of these cases. So you can implement that obviously with a divider that's shaped in this funny way, right? You can also map this onto another kind of physical problem that's easier to implement, and this is the thing that we are in the process of trying to do experiments on. Actually on the memory making part, on the how to build the optimal observer part. So the game here is that your divider has this funny shape, so that if your particle falls into, I shouldn't use a mouse. If your particle falls into this region here, the left region, then you know for sure that the right side is empty. So the probability that the left side is empty is then 0. If your particle falls in the middle, you know nothing, so the probability is 1/2. And on the right side, you know that the left side is empty. Okay? So in some sense, this is really pretty much the simplest intrinsic uncertainty that I can think of. Now the challenge for the observer is to map any observation onto some memory, and in such a way that it can infer which side is empty. And this best mapping doesn't necessarily have to be a coarse graining. It could be a probabilistic map. So the challenge then becomes to find that best probabilistic assignment. Do you have an intuition for this? What would be the best way to do this? Well, for once, it's going to depend on how many memory states do you use, right? And how many memory states you use depends on how much is it worth doing anything. And if I run the engine at one temperature, then the best thing I can do is do nothing. So I use one memory state that says I do nothing and I never interact with the work medium. It's just as good as anything else, right? Because that doesn't dissipate any energy and it gets me 0 net work out, which is the maximum anyway, okay? On the other end of the spectrum, you never want to use more than 3 states here, right? Because when you use 3 states, you can coarse grain into these 3 regions. You've captured all of the useful information completely. Yeah? So this is why it's a very simple problem. You're limited between either use 1 state or 2 states or 3 states. And then the question is, and then at some point, so how do we motivate the daemon to get off the couch? We motivate the daemon to get off the couch by making the sort of thermodynamic value of the useful information higher. How do we do that? We do that by increasing the higher temperature, the temperature at which the daemon can extract the work. Yeah? And so the ratio of higher to lower temperature is the relevant parameter here. As that increases, you're going to want to use more states for your memory. So if you have any kind of intuition for what would be optimal here, let's say for 2 states or, yeah, for 2 states in the intermediate tower regimes, sketch it down. So to solve this problem, you need to know a bunch of things. You need to know that these generalized and partially observable information engines have an upper bound on their average net work output, which is just the Boltzmann constant, and then there's the high temperature times the useful information. So in this case that I showed you, it would be the information that the memory keeps about this relevant quantity, which side is empty, minus the low temperature times the total information that's kept in memory. So the total information that's kept in memory would be the information between the memory and the observable. Yeah? And by data processing inequality, that is larger than the useful information, larger or equal, can be smaller. And this bound, both of these quantities depend on this memory making method, so they depend on your optimal map. And so then that gives you immediately a way to optimize here. You can find the best method to map your data to your memory by maximizing the upper bound on the average network output of your total engine, which is equivalent to minimizing the lower bound on dissipation. Why the bound? Why do I want to minimize the bound rather than just minimizing straight out the dissipation for some specific model? Well, because in the back of my mind, I'm still thinking about biology, and I know that in biology sometimes systems minimize dissipation, sometimes they actually have to whack away heat or make things go forward in time, and so they have to maybe maximize dissipation or at least not minimize it. So minimizing the lower bound on dissipation just lets you keep your options open, right? Because you're arranging your thinking in such a way that if you needed to be efficient, you could be. So it's kind of like a very mild request for intelligence. So you solve this problem and you realize, okay, this is a problem that's already been proposed in '99. It's the information bottleneck problem and has an algorithm associated with it. And so we can now use this algorithm to automate the daemon's intelligence. And another interesting thing you notice is if you write down, Clausius equivalence values over the whole cycle, added up over the whole cycle for the quasi-static limit, then you see that the dissipation sort of arises because useless information is being produced here. So if you memorize too much that you can't use, then that's what causes you to dissipate. And of course, all of these optimal solutions again depend on this ratio of high to low temperature. How am I doing for time? Pretty good. Now comes the answer to the problem, which hopefully didn't bore the crap out of you. Okay, so here's the problem again. And then, so what we did is we ran the algorithm on the problem. And we looked at the output of the algorithm. And then I realized that, we can parameterize this. And parameterizing it, then we can run another algorithm, which is less complicated than the self-consistent, algorithm, which is just optimizing the parameters, and then compare other solutions just as good, and they are just as good. And so this parameterized version allows us to interpret more easily what the strategies are. So they're actually quite simple. In the regime in which the daemon uses two memories so that it can make this, two memory states so that it can make this binary decision, the best assignment is if a data point falls on either one of these certain regions, right, then you assign it with a high probability to one of the states and the remaining probability to the other state. They have to add up to 1, right? And if it falls in the middle, you gamble and you assign it at random. Then there's a phase transition to using 3 states, and there, I think is interesting. I don't know, maybe it's obvious. I mean, in retrospect, all of it is obvious. But what happens at the phase transition is that suddenly you're allowed to use another state, and you commit all your resources to knowing when you know nothing. It's really important to know when you know nothing. You don't commit the resources to making these immediately deterministic. No, you commit it to making the state in which you do nothing deterministic. And then you pay attention to never assigning your data to the wrong state, but with some remaining probability, you still assign it to the state in which you do nothing. And why is this optimal? It's purely optimal because it saves you on cost. If you hadn't taken into account the cost of the daemon, you would have not found these strategies, right? If you didn't take into account the cost of the daemon, then the optimal thing to do would always to be coarse grain into 3 regions, because that gives you the full useful information. So with this parameterized model, we can actually calculate the lines of the phase diagram that we got numerically. So we were very satisfied that we could calculate these lines. It took a while. So you have a critical value of the width of the uncertain region. If that's larger than half of your box, you have a different kind of engine behavior. So if it's smaller than half of your box, then you have a phase transition from doing nothing to assigning with this strategy that I just told you to 2 states, and then another phase transition to 3 states, to the other strategy I showed you. And that phase transition always occurs at tau equals 2. And if the uncertain region is larger than 1/2 of your box, you don't have the 2-state solution anymore at all. You just have a straight phase transition straight between doing nothing or assigning 3 states. Because there's just too much uncertainty in that problem, and sort of like the 2-state area gets squeezed out. Like you can calculate, anyway, that's too much technical detail, sorry. Now compare this to an observer that would restrict itself to a class of functions to use which are only coarse graining. So now I'm only allowing myself to coarse grain the x-axis, so to make a deterministic partitioning, any which deterministic partitioning. So we calculated that by parametric optimization. One of the interesting things is that for the 2-state solution, you don't choose the symmetric one, you choose an asymmetric one, where you just put like this one of these halves, of these certain halves, into one state, and then the whole rest into the other state, rather than cutting in the middle. But what's even more interesting is look at the phase diagram. You have completely different engine behavior, right? You would have never discovered, if you confined yourself to deterministic coarse grainings, you would have never discovered that there's really 2 types of engines, depending on the width of the uncertain region. And you would have never discovered that that phase transition for the more certain engines is always at 2, because it's a completely different picture. Yeah? So I find that interesting. I don't know, maybe it's all obvious. And I want to end, and I think we still have a lot of time for questions, because I ended 5 minutes early. I should say thank you for FQx for sponsoring all of this, making all of this possible, and saving us through COVID and everything. It's just, and thank you all for creating the FQx community. It's so incredibly valuable. I don't know how to put it into words, so I won't try.